"Why are you still here?" Ethan Brooks asked. Clara Whitmore stood beside the church steps with a sewing basket pressed against her coat, while the last women of the relief committee carried their empty platters inside without looking at her. Someone had removed the chair she usually used near the kitchen door. Her place was gone before she had decided whether to sit. Clara glanced down the road toward the weathered boarding house, then toward the freight office where a notice promised passage east for anyone able to pay. She had 11 cents in her pocket. "I have work to finish," she said. Ethan looked at the basket. A child's blue shirt lay folded across the top, one sleeve neatly mended. He did not ask whose it was. He was a rancher from 3 miles north, a quiet man with dust on his boots and a split in one leather glove. Most days he came into town for nails, feed, or coffee, and left before anyone found a reason to keep him talking. That morning, he had watched 2 women pass Clara without returning the hems she had repaired for them. He had watched Clara place their unpaid work carefully into her basket anyway. Ethan stepped toward the church door, lifted the chair someone had carried inside, and set it back beneath the narrow awning. Then he placed his coffee cup on the step beside it. Steam rose between them. He said nothing more. Clara remained standing until he crossed the street to the general store. Only then did she sit. She wrapped both hands around the cup, but did not drink. The warmth reached her fingers through the tin. Near noon, a boy named Samuel Pike came running from the schoolhouse with one suspender hanging loose. His mother had died the previous winter, and his father worked daylight to dark at the livery. Clara set down the coffee, opened her sewing basket, and repaired the torn strap, while Samuel stood quietly between her knees. She reinforced the other side before sending him back. Ethan saw it through the store window. He also saw Clara slip the last biscuit from her pocket into the boy's hand. When he returned, the cup was washed and resting upside down on the step. Beside it lay his glove. The split seam closed with small, even stitches. Ethan turned it over once. Clara was gathering her things. The freight wagon would leave Friday morning. She had heard there might be work in Cheyenne. He flexed his repaired hand, then looked toward the empty chair. By sundown, he brought a wooden box from his wagon and set it beneath the awning. Inside were shirts, coats, and 2 pairs of children's trousers from his ranch. Honest work. Enough for several days. Clara touched the top shirt but did not lift it. Sewn inside the collar was a faded name she had not seen since her husband's burial. The name was Thomas Whitmore. Clara's thumb stayed on the faded letters until the church bell struck once for noon. Her husband had worn that shirt during their first winter in Wyoming, before the fever took him and before the town began speaking of her as though grief were a fault that could spread. She folded the collar inward and carried the box to the boarding house. That evening, she sorted every garment by weight, damage, and thread needed. She mended the children's trousers first. One knee required a patch cut from the inside of an old coat where no one would miss it. The other needed only patient stitching. By lamplight, the sewing basket sat open beside her chair, its wooden lid worn pale where Thomas's hand had once rested while he talked. Clara finished 6 pieces before sleep found her upright. The next morning, Ethan arrived before the general store opened. He brought no new questions. He set a paper packet of needles beside the coffee cup and placed 2 coins beneath it, payment for work already completed. Clara counted the coins once. The amount was exact. No charity hidden inside it. She handed him the repaired trousers, and he tested each seam with his work-roughened fingers before folding them over his arm. "These will hold," he said. Then he left. By afternoon, Mrs. Dyer came for a skirt Clara had hemmed the previous week. She took it without offering payment and paused when she saw Thomas's shirt across Clara's lap. Her mouth tightened. Some things ought to be put away. Clara threaded her needle. Some things still have work left in them. Mrs. Dyer walked off without answering. Samuel Pike had been sweeping the church porch nearby. He watched her go, then looked at Clara's empty palm. The next day, he returned with 3 pennies wrapped in a scrap of newspaper. His father had given them for the suspender repair. Clara accepted 2 and pushed one back across the step. Samuel studied her face, then tucked the penny into the sewing basket as though it belonged there. Ethan saw that. He also saw the freight notice Clara had folded beneath the basket lid. Passage east. Friday morning. At sunset, he brought another box from the ranch, smaller this time. Inside lay a woman's winter coat, carefully brushed, with Thomas Whitmore's name written on an old claim tag tied to the buttonhole. Clara looked up, but Ethan was staring at the tag as though he had never seen it before. Clara lifted the old coat from the wooden box and brushed a thumb across the worn collar. The fabric had faded unevenly where years of sun had reached it, but one patch along the shoulder still carried stitches she recognized. She had sewn them herself during their second winter together after Thomas caught the sleeve on a broken fence rail. Ethan watched quietly from the church steps. "He loaned me that coat once," he said at last. "A storm caught us on a cattle drive farther north. I meant to give it back." Clara looked at him. "He never mentioned you." Ethan nodded once. "We worked together only a few weeks." Nothing more followed. No grand story. No explanation larger than the truth. Clara folded the coat along the old creases and laid it beside her sewing basket. The silence settled comfortably between them. Before leaving, Ethan carried the wooden box beneath the church awning so the morning sun would not fall directly on her work. Then he noticed the loose leg of her chair. He crouched, tightened it with a pocket wrench from his saddlebag, tested it once, and stood again. It should hold now. He picked up the finished ranch shirts, left exact payment beside the coffee cup, and rode back toward the north pasture. Clara spent the afternoon mending without looking up very often. Samuel arrived after school with 2 buttons he had found outside the mercantile. She showed him how to sort them by size instead of color. He worked carefully until every button rested in its own small pile. When Mr. Pike came to collect his repaired suspenders, he noticed his son helping without being asked. He placed one extra shirt on Clara's table. "When you have time," he said. Clara nodded and entered his name in a small notebook she had begun keeping for paid work. No promises beyond that. The following morning, Ethan returned with another bundle of worn ranch clothes. He set them down beside the chair, then noticed Clara rubbing warmth back into her fingers before picking up the needle. He disappeared without a word and came back carrying a small iron stove that had been gathering dust in one of the ranch sheds. By noon, the stovepipe stood through the old schoolroom roof behind the church, cleaned and fitted. Ethan tested the draft, brushed soot from his hands, and stepped outside. "It throws better light than these steps," he said. Clara walked slowly through the empty room. 2 broad windows faced the morning sun. Shelves lined one wall. Dust covered everything, but the floor remained solid beneath her boots. She opened the nearest window and let fresh autumn air move through the room. Samuel followed with a broom nearly as tall as himself. Without speaking, he began sweeping one corner while Clara wiped the first table clean with an old cloth from her basket. Ethan repaired a sticking hinge before riding back to finish the afternoon chores. No one declared the room hers. No one needed to. By evening, her sewing basket rested on the table beside the window instead of beneath the church awning. The coffee cup stood beside it, still warm. For the first time in many months, Clara packed her needles at sunset without wondering where she would work the next morning. The next morning, Clara arrived before sunrise. The schoolroom still smelled of old pine, cool ashes, and dust that had rested too many years without being disturbed. She opened both front windows, tied back the curtains with strips of worn muslin, and swept slowly from the back wall toward the door. Samuel appeared carrying the same broom as yesterday. He did not ask where to begin. He simply chose the corner she had not yet reached. By the time the church bell rang, neat piles of broken slate, loose nails, and cracked chair legs waited outside for hauling away. Ethan rode in after feeding the horses. He leaned the repaired shirts against the wall, removed his hat, and studied the room without interrupting the work already happening. One window rattled whenever the wind crossed the yard. He fetched a ladder, tightened the loose frame, replaced one missing latch, and tested it twice before climbing down. Clara continued arranging thread by color and weight across the shelves. Neither thanked the other. The work itself was enough. Lucy arrived after breakfast carrying a small basket of mismatched buttons she had found inside an old kitchen tin. Clara emptied them across the table and showed both children how to separate pearl from bone, bone from wood, and wooden buttons by size. Samuel measured each pile twice before tying them with string. Lucy smiled each time she completed a row that matched. Clara left the best rows untouched so they could admire their own careful work. Near noon, 2 ranch hands stopped by with coats needing fresh elbows before the first frost. Clara measured each sleeve, marked every repair in her notebook, named a fair price, and promised they would be ready before Sunday. The men paid half, without hesitation. They had already seen enough to know she would keep her word. While they talked, Ethan quietly carried another table from the empty church storage shed. It bore old scratches and uneven legs, but it stood firmly once he slipped a thin cedar shim beneath one corner. Clara covered it with clean canvas and placed the heavier repairs there. By afternoon, the room had begun finding its own rhythm. Samuel swept the floor after every customer. Lucy folded finished shirts into neat stacks. Clara stitched steadily beside the window where the autumn light stayed longest. Ethan came and went between ranch chores, leaving split firewood beside the stove whenever the stack grew low. Some evenings he found a covered plate waiting near the kitchen door after returning late from the pasture. Some mornings Clara discovered fresh coffee resting beside the sewing basket before she unlocked the schoolroom. Neither mentioned the exchange. It simply became part of the day, as ordinary as sunrise. Late that Saturday, Mrs. Holt paused outside with 3 worn children's coats folded over one arm. She stood watching through the open doorway while Samuel carried folded shirts to the shelf and Lucy carefully brushed loose thread from the work table. Nothing inside looked hurried. Nothing looked lonely. Mrs. Holt stepped inside, laid the coats gently on the table, and asked, almost quietly, "Do you think you could teach another pair of hands to sew like this?" Clara looked first at the children, then at the empty chair beside her work table. She pulled it out from under the table and nodded once. Mrs. Holt returned the following Tuesday with 2 young mothers from the church and a basket filled with shirts too worn for the relief shelf, but too useful to throw away. Clara spread every garment across the long table and turned each one inside out before speaking. She showed them where cloth usually failed first, how a careful patch hidden beneath the elbow could make another winter possible, and why strong thread mattered more than perfect stitches. Lucy watched closely from the lower table, practicing on scraps of flour sack cloth before trying the real work. Samuel sat beside the ledger, carefully copying names exactly as Clara pronounced them. When he misspelled one, Clara crossed out nothing. She simply handed him another page and let him begin again. By the end of the afternoon, the women had repaired 6 children's shirts together. They left carrying their own work instead of someone else's charity. The next morning, a ranch hand named Ben Carter arrived wearing the coat Clara had patched the week before. He removed it only long enough to place another bundle on the table. "The sleeve held through branding," he said simply. Clara nodded once and measured the next repair. No one said more than necessary. Word traveled anyway. Before long, customers no longer came because Ethan had sent them. They came because someone else's coat had lasted. Ethan noticed the change without mentioning it. He continued bringing coffee before daylight whenever he rode into town, leaving the cup beside the sewing basket before heading back to the ranch. Clara always returned it washed before sunset. Some mornings, she tucked a warm biscuit beneath the folded cloth covering the cup. Other mornings, she left nothing except the empty cup turned upside down, and somehow that small habit came to mean the day had gone well. As autumn settled deeper across the valley, the stove burned from dawn until evening. Ethan quietly stacked fresh firewood beside the schoolroom wall every few days. Clara never found the pile empty. She answered by mending the torn pocket of his work coat before he noticed it had begun to fray. One afternoon, Lucy carefully folded the finished quilt across the small cot in the back room. A traveling widow and her little daughter, delayed by early snow, rested there for one night before continuing west the next morning. Clara accepted payment only for the coat she repaired before they left. The bed, the soup, and the warmth belonged to the room itself. Samuel watched them disappear down the road and asked whether everyone who entered would someday leave. Clara looked toward the candle waiting on the windowsill. "Not everyone," she said softly. That evening, Mrs. Dyer appeared at the doorway carrying a faded Sunday dress that had belonged to her late daughter. She held it carefully, almost reluctantly, before placing it into Clara's hands. "If anyone can make this useful again," she said, "I believe it is you." Clara unfolded the dress across the table without speaking. Mrs. Dyer did not leave immediately. Instead, she noticed Lucy sorting buttons, Samuel balancing the ledger, Ethan replacing a loose shelf bracket near the window, and the steady rhythm each person seemed to understand without instruction. She picked up a needle from the basket and quietly took the empty chair beside Clara. Mrs. Dyer returned the next morning before anyone else arrived. She carried her own thimble, a pair of worn scissors, and the faded dress she had left behind the evening before. Clara had already opened the windows, lit the stove, and placed the sewing basket beside the coffee cup Ethan had quietly delivered before sunrise. Mrs. Dyer sat without waiting to be invited. She unpicked the old seams while Clara measured new cloth for a growing boy whose sleeves had become too short before winter. Neither woman hurried to fill the silence. The steady pull of thread through fabric said enough. By mid-morning, Lucy was teaching another little girl how to match buttons by size instead of color. Samuel entered each finished garment into the ledger with careful handwriting that grew steadier every week. When a customer thanked him, he straightened his shoulders just a little before returning to his work. Ethan stopped by carrying 2 broken wooden stools from the ranch. He set them beside the wall, replaced the cracked crossbars, tightened every joint, and left them drying in the autumn sun before riding back to the pasture. Clara found them waiting at the door before noon. She placed one beside the lower table for the children and the other near the stove where older hands preferred to work. No one asked where the stools had come from. They simply became part of the room. As the days passed, more people began bringing work before garments were beyond saving. Ranchers learned that a careful repair cost less than replacing a coat after the first hard freeze. Mothers came together on Wednesday afternoons, each mending her own family's clothing while sharing thread, patterns, and quiet conversation across the long table. Clara walked from one pair of hands to another, correcting a stitch here, showing a stronger seam there, then returning to her own work without drawing attention to herself. The room no longer depended on her doing every task. It depended on the habits she had patiently built. One cold afternoon, Samuel noticed an elderly ranch widow standing uncertainly outside with a torn blanket folded across her arms. Before Clara even looked up, he opened the door, carried the blanket inside, and placed it gently on the work table exactly as he had seen Ethan do with every bundle of clothing. Clara smiled only with her eyes and showed him how to reinforce the worn edge with strips cut from an old flour sack. The woman watched the lesson more closely than the blanket itself. Before leaving, she pressed 2 fresh eggs into Samuel's hands because she had little money but wished to give something honest in return. Samuel set the eggs carefully beside the bread cooling near the stove instead of slipping them into his pocket. Clara entered nothing in the ledger. Some kindnesses balanced themselves without ink. That evening, Ethan arrived later than usual with sawdust still clinging to his sleeves. He had spent the day building narrow shelves beneath the front windows so finished garments would remain clean and folded until collected. Clara ran her hand across the smooth wood after he left. There was no flourish in the work, only careful edges sanded until no thread could catch. The next morning, every shelf was already full. Mrs. Holt laughed quietly as she looked around the room. People used to come here because they needed something mended, she said. Now they come because they know someone will be here. Clara looked toward the cabin across the yard, where smoke rose steadily from the chimney, then back to the candle waiting on the windowsill for another evening. Before she answered, Ruth Bell stepped through the doorway carrying a small bundle of folded clothes and her young daughter beside her. She did not ask whether there was work. She untied her apron, took the empty chair Mrs. Dyer had left, and began threading a needle as though she had always belonged there. Snow arrived before dawn on the first Monday of December. Clara reached the schoolroom while the road was still quiet, brushing fresh powder from the front step before unlocking the door. She lit the candle, stirred the stove back to life, and set the coffee cup Ethan had left beneath her shawl to keep it warm. By the time the sun climbed over the cottonwoods, the room already carried the familiar sounds of thread passing through cloth and wood settling in the heat. Ruth hemmed children's sleeves beside the front window. Mrs. Dyer patiently taught Lucy how to hide a patch beneath a coat pocket instead of placing it on top. Samuel checked each finished garment against the ledger before hanging it neatly on the new shelves Ethan had built. Clara no longer reached for every task herself. She moved quietly from table to table, answering questions only when needed, then returning to the code in her own hands. The work had begun to belong to everyone. Late that afternoon, a ranch hand arrived carrying a bundle wrapped in canvas. Inside were 6 winter coats from neighboring ranches. They heard you could make them last another season, he said. Clara accepted the bundle, wrote each name into the ledger, and promised nothing she could not finish. After he left, Ruth counted the garments and looked toward the crowded shelves. "We will need another table." Clara glanced around the room. Every chair was filled. Every corner held useful work. Before she could answer, Ethan appeared with rough pine boards balanced across his wagon. He measured the empty space beneath the west window, built a simple work table before sunset, swept away every shaving, and returned the borrowed tools to the barn without waiting for supper. The next morning, the new table was already covered with folded coats. No one remembered when it had become part of the room. That was how most good things arrived now. On Wednesday evening, Clara found Lucy asleep beneath the finished quilt, her hand resting against the sewing basket exactly as it had months before. Samuel had fallen asleep over the ledger, his pencil still tucked between his fingers. Ruth quietly lifted him onto the cot beside her daughter before covering both children with an extra blanket. Clara trimmed the candle and looked across the yard. Ethan was repairing the loose latch on the ranch gate by lantern light before the coming storm. She carried 2 slices of warm bread and a fresh cup of coffee to him without calling his name. He accepted both with a quiet nod, then finished tightening the latch before taking the first sip. Neither hurried back inside. Snow drifted softly across the fence rails while the lantern burned between them. The following Saturday, the Church Relief Committee held its winter gathering. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara received an invitation with everyone else's. Her name appeared in the same careful handwriting as every other family's. She read it once, folded it neatly, and slipped it beneath the lid of her sewing basket. That evening, instead of leaving the invitation there, she carried it across the yard and placed it beside Ethan's coffee cup on the kitchen table. Then she walked back to the schoolroom, packed enough bread for Sunday, counted the children's pennies into their jars, and quietly locked the front door. When Ethan entered the kitchen later that night, he saw the invitation waiting beside the cup. He picked it up, read Clara's name, and laid 2 place settings on the table instead of 1. Sunday morning arrived with fresh snow resting lightly across the ranch fences. Clara folded the church invitation into her Bible and carried the sewing basket across the yard before daylight. Ethan had already finished feeding the horses. A fresh pot of coffee waited on the stove, and 2 cups stood beside it without discussion. Lucy wandered into the kitchen rubbing sleep from her eyes, followed by Samuel carrying the ledger beneath one arm because he had forgotten to leave it at the schoolroom the night before. Ruth laughed quietly as she brushed flour from her apron and set another loaf of bread onto the table. No one had planned breakfast together. It simply happened because everyone was already there. After church, the townspeople gathered in the fellowship hall while children chased one another between the wagon sheds. Clara expected to sit near the back as she always had before. Instead, Mrs. Holt waved her toward the long table where the women from the mending room had already saved an empty chair. Mrs. Dyer was seated on one side. Lucy occupied the other. Clara hesitated only a moment before taking the seat. Across the room, Ethan remained near the doorway speaking quietly with 2 neighboring ranchers. One mentioned that winter repairs on work clothes had become easier since the schoolroom opened. The other nodded toward Clara without lowering his voice. "Our boys made it through branding because those coats held." Ethan said nothing. He simply looked toward Clara, then back at the men, as though the matter needed no further explanation. Later that afternoon, several wagons stopped outside the schoolroom. Families from neighboring ranches unloaded baskets filled with worn blankets, children's coats, and shirts that had seen too many seasons. Clara counted the bundles with Samuel while Ruth sorted them by size. Lucy welcomed each family before carrying the smaller garments to the lower table. No one asked whether there was enough room. Ethan quietly removed an old storage cabinet from the back wall, carried it into the barn, and built another row of open shelves before evening. The ranch hands helped lift them into place after finishing their chores. Mrs. Holt arranged folded quilts across the highest shelf. Mrs. Dyer labeled thread jars in careful handwriting so anyone could find what they needed. By sunset, the room looked less like one woman's workshop and more like something the whole valley had built together. Before everyone left, Ethan stepped outside and fastened a simple wooden lantern bracket beside the front door. He hung the candle there instead of inside the window where winter drafts often reached it. The light could now be seen from the road long before travelers reached the gate. Clara watched him tighten the final screw, brush the sawdust from his hands, and step away to make certain the lantern hung straight. He never announced what he had done. He simply made it easier for strangers to find the place. That evening, after the last family rode home, Clara carried the coffee cups inside, while Ethan closed the schoolroom shutters against the wind. She noticed the new key he had quietly placed beside the others on the small hook by the cabin door. It matched neither the schoolroom nor her room beside the kitchen. Lucy looked up at Ethan. "What is that one open?" Ethan smiled only with his eyes. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will all see." The new key opened the small storage room beside the schoolhouse, a place that had stood empty for years except for broken desks and forgotten shelves. Before sunrise, Ethan unlocked the door, carried the old furniture into the yard, and began repairing what could still be used. He replaced loose boards, straightened bent hinges, and sanded rough edges until children could run their hands across the wood without catching a splinter. Clara arrived carrying the sewing basket and paused only long enough to understand what he was doing. Then she picked up a broom and swept the floor while Ruth washed the windows from the inside. Samuel organized nails into small jars. Lucy carefully folded the finished quilt and spread it across the narrow bed they placed beneath the window. By noon, the room no longer looked forgotten. It looked ready. That afternoon, the young widow who had arrived weeks before with her little daughter unpacked the last of her belongings into the cupboard Ethan had repaired. Clara showed her where extra blankets were kept and where fresh bread cooled each morning beside the stove. Nothing was given with ceremony. Everything had a place because everyone had helped make one. Winter settled fully over the valley. The mending room remained busy, but its rhythm had changed. Ruth now taught new arrivals how to strengthen worn seams before they failed. Mrs. Dyer measured cloth with steady hands that no longer hesitated. Samuel balanced the ledger without help. Lucy proudly stitched straight enough that Clara no longer needed to mark every row with red thread. Some mornings travelers came only to warm their hands beside the stove before continuing west. Some stayed long enough to earn supper by repairing coats or patching quilts. The candle beside the front door burned every evening, visible from the road until the last customer had gone home. It became less a signal for business than a quiet promise that someone would answer the door. On the first Sunday after Christmas, the ranch kitchen filled before church. Bread cooled beneath clean towels. Coffee steamed gently between the cups. Ruth's little girl helped Lucy set the table, while Samuel counted chairs instead of customers for the first time in months. Clara entered carrying the sewing basket she had carried since the day the town had tried to leave her behind. She placed it on the shelf beside the door instead of keeping it close against her side. Ethan noticed, but he said nothing. He simply reached for another plate and laid it on the table before anyone asked. There was no empty chair waiting to be taken away now. Every place was already expected. After breakfast, Clara washed the coffee cups while Ethan dried them and returned each one to the same shelf. When they finished, she picked up the candle from the windowsill of the mending room and set it beside the cabin door instead. The light still welcomed strangers. It simply shone from home now. Ethan opened the door as families gathered outside for church, then stepped aside without a word. Clara crossed the threshold, carrying nothing in her hands. For the first time since Thomas's passing, she did not wonder where she belonged before walking inside.